fire in the wilderness. The wind howls through broken marble. Once, the heart of the world beat here beneath the arches of Rome, where senators debated destiny and legions carried the eagle to the ends of the earth. But now the temples are cold, their gods silent. Statues lie toppled among weeds, and in the distance, the sound of chanting rises from what was once a granary, now turned into a chapel. The old world is dying, and something unseen is stirring in its ashes. The fall of Rome was not a single night of fire, it was a long twilight. Barbarians crossed the Rhine, emperors fell like fading stars, and the streets of the eternal city grew haunted by hunger and plague. Yet amid this ruin, men and women began retreating into the wilderness, not in fear, but in faith. They sought not to rebuild the empire, but to save the soul of man. In the deserts of Egypt, under a sun that scorched the bones of travelers, a figure named Anthony abandoned all worldly comfort. He fought not men, but demons, both within and without. His solitude became a fortress, and his prayer a sword. From these hermits of the sands came a new kind of army. They bore no shields, no banners, only the name of Christ. They called themselves monks. In time, they spread northward, over mountains and through forests, where wolves roamed and pagan altars still smoked with sacrifice. Their mission was not conquest, but conversion, to turn wild lands into gardens of prayer. The cloister became the new citadel, its walls humming with psalms instead of steel. Every illuminated manuscript, every bell tolling in the dawn mist, was an act of defiance against chaos. And yet, outside the monastery walls, the world still burned. The Goths sacked cities, the Vandals roamed the coasts, and whole provinces vanished into memory. The Roman roads, once built for legions, now carried pilgrims barefoot, ragged, clutching relics. But the old Roman discipline found an unlikely heir. The same spirit that once forged soldiers of empire began to shape soldiers of faith. In the ruins of civilization, the church stood as the last unbroken legion. Bishops became leaders where governors had fled. Priests spoke Latin in the streets where emperors no longer ruled. There were moments when it seemed the faith itself would be extinguished, when pagan warlords mocked the cross, and Christian scholars fled with books hidden under cloaks. But the light refused to die. Monasteries became islands of learning, where monks copied Virgil beside the Gospels, keeping the ancient world alive even as they built a new one. In Ireland, far from Rome's collapse, St. Patrick lit bonfires on pagan hills, declaring that darkness would not have the final word. Across Gaul and Britain, stories spread of saints who tamed beasts, healed kings, and challenged tyrants not with armies, but with miracles. By the 6th century, the wilderness was no longer a place of exile, it had become holy ground. Monks carved stone crosses where druids once made sacrifice. Pilgrims followed the paths of martyrs, seeking relics like weapons of hope. From the ruins of empire, a new world was being forged, one not of marble and empire, but of soul and sacrifice. The saints had become soldiers, and their battlefield was eternity. And so, as the smoke of Rome faded into the horizon, a strange peace settled over the ruins. Not the peace of victory, but of purpose. In the flickering light of monastery candles, the words of Scripture met the wisdom of Athens. Faith and reason clasped hands amid the wreckage. The wilderness that once swallowed men had become the cradle of a new civilization. For in the end, every empire falls, but the spirit that walks through its ashes may yet outlive its name. The cross and the sword. The clang of steel meets the whisper of prayer. Europe, once shattered into tribes and forgotten towns, begins to breathe again. Smoke curls from new hearths, bells ring from timber churches, and in the halls of kings, the sign of the cross replaces the sign of the eagle. But this rebirth is not peaceful, it is baptized in both water and blood. The faith that once hid in catacombs now walks with kings, and with its rise, the line between saint and soldier begins to blur. The story begins with a warrior, Clovis, king of the Franks. His realm stretches from the Rhine to the Loire, a land of fierce pagan gods and restless swordsmen. In battle, Clovis calls upon Wotan and the old spirits, but his queen, Clotilda, whispers of another god, one who conquers not through fire, but through forgiveness. When his armies falter, Clovis makes a vow before this unseen lord. Victory follows, and on a winter's day in Reims, he kneels in the baptismal waters. As the bishop anoints him, he declares, "Bend thy neck, proud Sicambrian, adore what thou hast burned, and burn what thou hast adored." In that moment, a warrior becomes a Christian king, and the kingdom of the Franks becomes the first stone in the foundation of Christian Europe. From that baptism flows an empire of faith. The church, once hunted and humble, now sits beside thrones. Bishops advise kings. Abbots bless armies. Yet with power comes peril. The cross that sanctifies the sword can also sharpen it. The wars of conquest are draped in holy robes, pagans to be converted, heretics to be purged. Still, amid the ambition, something sacred flickers. The warrior ideal is reborn not merely to conquer lands, but to defend souls. The knight is yet unborn, but his spirit stirs in these first Christian kings, men who believe that battle can be sanctified if fought for truth. But not all battles are fought on fields of blood. In the cloisters of Iona, Benedictine monks carve rules for a life of order and obedience, a discipline as strict as any legion. Ora et labora, pray and work, becomes their creed. They tame the wild earth as they tame the wild heart. Fields bloom beside abbeys, and knowledge, once thought lost, flows again from ink-stained fingers. The monk and the soldier mirror each other, both sworn to obedience, both bound to a higher cause. Yet one fights with plough and pen, the other with shield and spear. By the 8th century, another power rises, not from within Europe, but beyond the sea. The crescent flag of Islam spreads across Africa and Spain, swift and unstoppable. The faith of Christ now faces an equal in conviction and courage. The battles of the soul become battles of the world. Into the storm steps a figure whose name will echo for centuries, Charles Martel, the Hammer. At Tours, in the year 732, Frankish and Arab blades clash in the mists of dawn. The chroniclers will later say that Christendom itself was at stake. When the battle ends, the Franks stand victorious, and Europe breathes a fragile sigh of survival. The victory of Tours is not only a triumph of arms, but of identity. From that day, the idea of a Christian Europe takes root, a civilization bound not by race or language, but by faith. Martel's descendants will bear this idea like a banner. One of them, a broad-shouldered warrior named Charles the Great, will forge it into empire. Yet beneath the glory of kings and battles, the saints continue their quieter conquest. Missionaries like Boniface cross forests to fell sacred oaks and baptize chieftains. Each axe swing, each whispered prayer chips away at the old gods, turning wilderness into Christendom. Still, tension hums beneath the hymns. Can faith wield power without losing purity? Can the sword serve the cross without staining it? These questions haunt every chapel and battlefield alike. But for now, Europe marches forward, united by a dream that heaven might be won not just in monasteries, but in kingdoms, through courage, conviction, and sacrifice. The cross and the sword move as one, and the age of holy kings begins. The blood of martyrs, the birth of nations, from the soil of sacrifice, kingdoms bloom. The echo of steel fades into the sound of chanting choirs. In the ruins of empire and the smoke of battle, a new Europe begins to take shape, not carved by Caesar's ambition, but by saints, scholars, and kings who believed that to rule a people was to shepherd their souls. Faith is no longer a whisper in the catacombs, it is the heartbeat of nations. Yet every baptism, every coronation comes at a price, for in this age, belief is not a comfort, but a crucible. The baptism of Clovis had opened the floodgates. Across the wild lands of the north, kings began to see conversion not merely as piety, but as power, a new way to unify their tribes under a single god, a single law. The ancient gods of oak and thunder faded into memory, their altars overtaken by crosses, but not all yielded willingly. In the forests of Saxony and the cold rivers of the Danes, fire still burned for Odin and Freya. The missionaries who ventured there carried no weapons, only words, yet their courage often outshone any knights. They were wanderers armed with scripture, stepping into lands where the gospel was met with blades. One of them was Saint Boniface. Born in Anglo-Saxon England, he crossed the sea into the dark heart of Germany, where pagan tribes ruled by the sword. In the sacred grove of Geismar stood the great Donar oak, worshipped for generations. Boniface, in a single act of defiance, raised his axe and felled it. The crowd gasped, yet no thunder came. No gods answered. In that silence, the people saw power shift from the old world to the new. The oak became the timber for a church, and the land that once honored Thor began to whisper the name of Christ. Boniface would later die for his mission, struck down by pagan warriors, his blood soaking the ground like a second baptism. But where saints planted seeds, kings raised banners. Charles the Great, Charlemagne, the grandson of Martel, stood as the living bridge between sword and scripture. He dreamed of a Christian empire, not of marble, but of unity. When he was crowned emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800, the echoes of Rome returned, but this was no pagan empire reborn. It was a realm of faith, ruled by divine right, where the crown and the cross were bound together like body and soul. Charlemagne opened schools for peasants, invited scholars from distant lands, and decreed that monasteries must teach not only prayer, but letters for the mind, too, must serve God. Yet, the emperor's zeal was not without shadow. The Saxon wars dragged for decades, as Charlemagne's armies marched east to convert by force. Entire villages were baptized at sword point, their resistance drowned in rivers of blood. For the first time, Christ's name was spread through conquest, and the question that haunted the faithful returned with new urgency. Can salvation be compelled? Still, even amid the violence, the shape of Europe changed forever. Pagan kings were replaced by Christian rulers, their courts echoing with hymns, their laws rooted in scripture. The age of the barbarian was ending. The age of Christendom had begun. Through this mingling of violence and vision, the church became the soul of the continent. Monks turned wilderness into farmlands. Abbeys rose where once there were only forests. The relics of martyrs became the treasures of towns, guarded like crowns. Pilgrims journeyed for months to touch the bones of saints, believing that grace could be found in dust. The same Europe that had once torn itself apart with tribal feuds now shared a single story of suffering redeemed, of death reborn as life. By the 9th century, the line between nation and faith blurred. To be a Frank, a Saxon, a Lombard was to be Christian. To rebel against the cross was to stand outside civilization itself. The saints had become symbols, their relics like standards in battle. And yet, the peace that Christendom promised remained fragile. As the fires of the north began to burn once more, Viking ships gliding like dragons across the rivers, Europe would again be tested. The age of conversion had given birth to nations. The age of invasion would test their souls. The Crusaders light and shadow. The horizon burns with both glory and despair. By the 11th century, the faith that had stitched together kingdoms now spilled beyond Europe's forests and rivers. Jerusalem, the city where heaven and earth seemed to meet, became the spark for a storm of ambition, devotion, and destruction. Pilgrims crossed mountains and deserts, leaving hearths and homelands behind, carrying only what they could bear and a single, unshakable belief that to see the Holy Sepulchre was to glimpse eternity itself. The call came from a pope, his voice carried over the hills of Christendom. The Holy Land must be defended, the sacred places returned to Christian hands. From Norman knights to German princes, men and women took the vow, leaving behind their villages, their families, their pasts. They called themselves Crusaders, soldiers of God, bound to a cause that promised salvation in life and death. Yet for every act of courage, the path was soaked in blood. On the roads to Constantinople and across the Anatolian plains, towns were sacked, caravans destroyed, and the line between righteous war and vengeance blurred into dust and fire. Among them was Godfrey of Bouillon, who would become the first ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He was neither saint nor simple soldier, but a man whose devotion and brutality were inseparable. His men marched under crosses sewn onto their tunics, yet their victories came through siege engines and slaughter. When the walls of Jerusalem fell in 1099, the city became a theatre of triumph and horror. Chroniclers write of streets running red, of temples and mosques desecrated, of cries that haunted the dawn. And yet, in the eyes of those who had pledged themselves to God, this carnage was justice, sanctified by faith. Beyond the battlefield, the Crusades reshaped the soul of Europe. The exchange of knowledge between East and West brought scholars, architects, and artisans into new worlds. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy treasures thought lost in Europe were rekindled by contact with the Islamic world. Yet the cost of enlightenment was measured in human suffering, and the shadows of moral compromise stretched long. Knights returned home, their armor dented, their consciences scarred, bringing both riches and resentment to lands that had never seen such fire. The Crusades also gave rise to legends that would echo through the centuries. Stories of saints appearing on battlefields, of visions guiding armies, of relics granting impossible victory, blurred history and myth. Pilgrims spoke of the Holy Lance, of the true cross, of miracles that turned tides of battle. And in these tales, Europe saw itself not merely as a continent, but as a chosen people, a civilization with a divine mission. Yet the shadow of doubt lingered for every miracle. There were massacres. For every victory, 1,000 innocents perished. Faith and ferocity were inseparable companions. By the end of the 12th century, the Crusader states in the Levant had hardened into fragile outposts, precarious and embattled. Europe, too, had been changed irrevocably, its nobles more worldly, its kings more ambitious, its church both revered and feared. The age of the Crusade was both a high tide and a warning that even holy ideals, when married to mortal ambition, could bring devastation as well as salvation. Yet in the minds of men and women who marched across deserts in the name of God, the shadow never extinguished the light. In the quiet monasteries back home, monks wrote chronicles of the Crusades, illuminated in gold and crimson, capturing both the heroism and the horror. The stories of distant lands, of saints guiding swords, of ordinary men confronting destiny, passed into legend. Europe had ventured beyond itself, discovering both its noblest aspirations and its darkest impulses. The line between saint and soldier had never been thinner or more fateful, and the memory of those centuries of fire and devotion would echo for generations, shaping kingdoms, faith, and hearts alike. Ashes of faith, echoes of eternity. Empires crumble, but their shadows linger in stone and spirit. The Crusades receded like a storm, leaving behind a world scarred, enlightened, and transformed. Jerusalem, the prize of so many hearts and blades, passed through hands as swiftly as the tides of the sea, and Europe turned inward, seeking meaning amid the ruins of conquest. Cathedrals rose where villages had burned. Relics of martyrs became treasures in towns and abbeys. Faith, once fought for in distant deserts, now anchored itself in stone, in choir, and in the rhythm of daily life. Monks continued to illuminate manuscripts, their tiny hands breathing life into words that had survived fire, plague, and barbarian raids. In cloisters across France, England, and Italy, Knowledge was preserved, debated, and expanded. The works of Aristotle, Plato, and Ptolemy mingled with Scripture, as though wisdom itself were a bridge between the mortal and the divine. And in these quiet acts, the soldiers of faith, the monks, became the unseen architects of Europe's enduring spirit, a civilization built on both contemplation and courage. Kings and queens, their crowns heavier with the weight of legacy, navigated a world reshaped by saints and warriors alike. The balance between power and piety was delicate. To rule without justice was folly. To lead without faith was unthinkable. Charlemagne's descendants, and the lords who rose after him, knew that the sword could secure lands, but only the cross could command allegiance of hearts. Courts became theaters of both political intrigue and spiritual symbolism, where prayers and proclamations intertwined like twin threads in a tapestry of destiny. Yet the shadows never left entirely. In the forests of the north, the echoes of old gods lingered, a whispered storm among the trees, a pagan memory in the streams. Even as cathedrals soared toward the heavens, there were moments when Europe remembered the wildness it had conquered, the mysteries it had tried to bind. And in those memories, the saints and soldiers were not always heroes, but witnesses to the complex, often contradictory nature of faith, capable of both creation and destruction, devotion and violence, mercy and wrath. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had become a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities, each carrying the legacy of martyrs and warriors alike. Pilgrimages continued, Crusader legends inspired knights, and monasteries educated both the humble and the powerful. Yet even as the continent solidified, the past lived on in whispers, in the stories told by firelight, in the songs of wandering minstrels, in the ink-stained margins of illuminated codices. History, it seemed, had folded back upon itself, allowing the voices of saints and soldiers to speak across centuries. And so, as the sun sets on the 1,000-year journey of faith and force, we see the pattern clearly. Empires rise and fall, kings wield power, armies clash, but the spirit endures. Europe's soul, forged in fire, tempered by prayer, and baptized in blood, carries both light and shadow. Saints and soldiers are entwined in legend and memory, their deeds shaping the world long after their bodies have returned to dust. Because the past is never truly gone, it's waiting to be reborn.